I'm Tanya Ward and I'm the Chief Executive of the Children's Rights Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's seminar. Look, this event is coming at a real crossroads for the education system. We've just survived the first phase of a global pandemic with a major interruption in the education and learning of children and young people throughout the country. We've just had the second most successful vaccination programme in Europe, and schools are back again and working hard to keep the doors open every day. So at this crossroads, we need to think about where we need to go next. And of course, some of the serious issues that the education system we're dealing with are still with us. And at the same time, there's lots of new issues that we have to deal with as well. Today's event is the first of 3 events that the Children's Rights Alliance is organising in September with our partners to the Education Futures campaign. The first one today is on reduced timetables and alternative education. But our one next week will look at disadvantaged education, and one after that will look at mental health and well-being, all the issues that are really bubbling up because of the restriction in education for children and young people and the move to online learning. So today's event comes at a really interesting time as well, because what we know is the government is about to publish guidelines to deal with the use or misuse of reduced timetables. And we'll have an input from Minister for State, Josepha Manikin, at the opening of the seminar, and she'll talk in detail about what those guidelines look like. But I suppose that the important thing to know from the outset, for those of you who aren't aware of the detail of it, reduced timetables are situations where children are put on a reduced number of hours or days a week in the school year. It can happen sometimes for very good reasons, like a child has only arrived in the country and the school might be trying to integrate the child into school life. Perhaps the child has been sick and they're trying to reintegrate the child. But we know from our members in the Children's Rights Alliance and for others that there is potential misuse of reduced timetables affecting children and young people across the country. It's something that I was aware when I joined the Children's Rights Alliance over 9 years ago, when I was campaigning around the children's referendum. And my first introduction was a representative from a traveller group in Cork who asked me, would the children's referendum deal with this issue? And I said, what's the issue? And she said, well, I have several traveller children that only go to school for 3 days a week. And 3 days a week. And why is that happening? She said, well, the school can't cope. And I said, well, that's actually unlawful under the 1998 Education Act, so that shouldn't be happening. And what has been really striking for me and for others in the sector is there's the growing trend in the use of reduced timetables in Ireland. And that's a symptom of something else in Ireland as well. We have a fantastic panel today to really unpick what those issues are and to respond to the news that we have guidelines that are about to be published by government, which is really welcome, to be honest, because it's really the first step if we're going to address this as an issue. We also have a follow-up panel looking at the future of alternative education, because many of you will be aware that alternative education, there's some great success stories emerging, and we know that it is part of the answer to address reduced timetables. For some children, perhaps, let's say, who've been failed by the education system, or for other children that have very complex needs, alternative learning sites can really help them progress. And I suppose the key message for us who are interested in children's rights, we're interested in what happens to children and young people, is to ensure that all children get to reach their full potential, whatever that actually is, and that we all have high aspirations for children and young people in this country. I hope that's a key message that comes from today. So just in terms of our running order, we have an input, as I said, from Josepha Manikin, who's the Minister for State for Special Education and Inclusion. It's great that we have a minister in that position. We then have a panel discussion on reduced timetables. And we'll also have a break for about 10 minutes between 10:50 and 11 a.m. And then we'll have a second panel discussion in relation to alternative education. If you'd you'd like to tweet during the event, please use there's two hashtags that we're using today. It's Children's Futures IRL and Education Futures as well, because as you know, we're about to enter a big phase where education reform is on the agenda. There will be a Citizens' Assembly on the issue, and we're hoping that our partners in the education area can use that as a handle so we can have this ongoing online discussion around the field of education. So I want to first then introduce the Minister's input, and then I'll introduce the second panel for the first panel actually on reduced timetables. So we'll just pass on then to the input from the video from the Minister. Thanks.
Accordia. I welcome the opportunity to speak to you today on the issue of reduced school days, and I'd like to thank Tanya Ward and her team at the Children's Rights Alliance for this invitation. And while I cannot be with you in person today, I hope you have a productive and informative morning. Special education is a hugely important and valued part of our education system, and as the dedicated minister in this area, my goal is to ensure that the educational rights of every child are fully vindicated and that the values of inclusion and opportunity remain at the heart of our education system for every child and young person. We know that the past few months have been unprecedented for everyone, especially those working in and involved in the education system. We have seen restrictions, a move to online learning for a period of time, and huge pressures placed on staff and families. And while there's still a way to go, I'm hopeful that we're approaching the next stage, which will involve, we hope, a little bit less pressure on everyone and allow us to look ahead to some of the medium-term and long-term reforms that are needed. And from my part in the Department of Education, a return to normality should not involve a return to how things were. We must continue to move forward for the benefit of all of our young people, including those with additional needs. We've made huge strides to date with special education currently funded to the highest degree ever, record numbers of SNAs, SETs and special classes, new special schools opening, and to focus on a culture of inclusion in our mainstream schools. Today, in particular, I would like to discuss the area of reduced school days and how they are used in our school system. The programme for government set out a commitment to ensure reduced school days are used in a limited manner and only where absolutely necessary. And I know this is important. A young person has a right to an education and should not have this right impeded by the use of a reduced school day where it is not strictly beneficial. And this is why I support the call for the publication of guidelines in this area and effective monitoring for the first time. Inclusion is an important part of my brief as Minister for Special Education and Inclusion. Attendance at school for the full school day is central to ensuring that children have an inclusive education experience and achieve the best possible outcomes. I am pleased that guidelines for reduced school days are at an advanced stage and will shortly be published. Crucially, we've also committed to ensure robust data collection on the use of reduced school days. These guidelines will meet the programme for government commitment and is another step in creating an education system where every child and young person feels valued, supported and nurtured so they can reach their full potential. The guidelines will also provide much needed clarity for both schools and parents on the use of reduced school day by schools. They will also help the TUSLA Education Support Service and the NCSE in advising schools and parents. In advance of publishing the guidelines, we are aware of the need to strike a balance. We recognise on the one hand that there may be exceptional circumstances when a reduced school day is necessary, is in the best interest of the child or young person and only used as a transitional and supportive intervention for a pupil's reintegration into the school. But at the same time, we want to ensure that a reduced school day is not considered the default approach in dealing with difficult situations. A reduced school day should not be in any way a standard aspect of a child's experience of school. We have taken into account the experiences outlined in various fora by parents and advocacy groups, including those representing travellers and children with special educational needs. And we've also taken on board the views expressed by schools and education partners. The guidelines are intended to ensure that the best interests of the child, their education and their development is paramount in any decision making by schools. The guidelines acknowledge that most schools already approach the issue in the best interests of the pupil. However, the guidelines are designed to ensure a consistency of approach across schools. This consistency and oversight is vital. The guidelines are underpinned by the principles that a reduced school day should not be used as a sanction. It should be applied proportionately, and it should last only as long as is necessary to facilitate a return to school on a full-time basis. A fundamental principle is that the guidelines ensure the consent of parents is central to the process prior to implementation of a reduced school day. The guidelines also ensure that the use of reduced days is time-bound, with the requirement for the school to put in place a plan to reintegrate the student to full-day attendance. The guidelines outline to schools the steps they need to take prior to consideration of a reduced school day. This includes engagement with the relevant support services and professionals and the development and implementation of a student support plan for an appropriate period of time. In the exceptional circumstances where a reduced school day is being considered, clear evidence-based reasons for its consideration as a relevant and appropriate intervention are required. A further key component of the guidelines is the requirement of schools to notify TUSLA Education Support Service of the intention to place a student on a reduced school day. TUSLA Education Support Service will provide support and guidance to both parents and schools in relation to the use of a reduced school day. Once operational, this will allow information on the use of a reduced school day to be collected and monitored, and for the TUSLA Education Support Service to intervene along with relevant agencies where this is necessary. The TUSLA Education Support Services will submit reports to the Department of Education on an ongoing basis to allow for continued monitoring of the guidelines. This will inform policy going forward, and the guidelines will of course be subject to review. It is acknowledged that among the cohort of children on reduced school days are learners with special educational needs, and more broadly on the theme of inclusive education, supporting vulnerable learners and those with high levels of need must be at the heart of what we achieve through education. Funding of $2 billion has been secured for the special education budget this year to make additional provision for children with special educational needs, meaning the numbers of special classes, special education teachers and special needs assistants are now at unprecedented levels. A record 2,118 special classes opened their doors as schools reopened this September, and an additional 990 SNAs are being added. However, we know that there is so much more to do in this area, and I am really committed to doing that. Every week I meet with families and schools and hear their personal experiences and difficulties with the system. I know acutely the challenges that exist and the work that remains. We have made a start and we are determined to build on this. The Department of Education aims to support all learners to achieve their potential through education. Delivering equality of opportunity in schools is the government's main policy initiative aimed at tackling educational disadvantage in primary and post-primary schools. This year, the department will spend over $150 million on the DESH programme, which supports 887 schools catering for approximately 185,000 students, which in turn represents approximately 20% of the school population. I'd like to acknowledge the significant work of Children's Rights Alliance in advocating for vulnerable children and families, and I want to thank schools for their work in supporting the many thousands of vulnerable children and young people in getting an education. Finally, I wish to acknowledge the work of parents with additional needs for their work in supporting their children as they negotiate the many barriers to living an active and fulfilling life. Gurm Maghliv.
So that's our input from Minister Dasifa Malikan. I think it's a very important intervention really in our discussion, because she is shedding some light on what the guidelines and reduced timetables are going to look like into the future. And I think what was significant for me in her statement was a young person has a right to an education and should not have this right impeded by the use of reduced school days where it's not strictly beneficial. And there's clearly an emphasis in the guidelines on what's best for the the child involved. It's also significant that we're going to have monitoring now of this practice, and that TUSLA will be collating reports in this area, because it's one of the things that we've all struggled with, is to identify how many children and young people are actually affected by this practice across the country. So that's a really important initiative. I suppose I want to thank the Minister for that input. So to move through our panel discussion, just to let those of you who are in attendance, we have 152 people at the event, and it's also being broadcast live on Facebook. You can ask a question if you're attending the event through the question and answers box, and the panel will be able to see the questions. And I'll try to get to as many questions as possible during the event. But if I don't get to your question and it's a burning question, please do email us at the Children's Rights Alliance, and we'll pass it on to one of the panelists. So just to introduce our panel today, we have Sandra Irwin-Gowron, Head of Education and Development at Educate Together. We have Bernard Joyce, Director of the Irish Traveller Movement. We have Adam Harris, CEO of As I Am. We have Deborah Brennan, Lecturer at TU Dublin and researcher of the Inclusion Ireland report on reduced timetables. We have Mairead Mahon, a PhD student in UCD. And we'll also have Professor Devine, Dipna Devine, join us at 10 a.m. as well. So I suppose, moving to our panellists, we've just been given an overview there of the guidelines. Mairead, I might start with you. It strikes me the key here with these guidelines is a really important first step by the Department of Education. What's your response? And I suppose, what do you think is going to be important from an implementation point of view?
Okay, Tanya, firstly, thanks very much, and thanks for Children's Rights Alliance for continuing to flag this issue. I'm in UCD now, but this was a burning issue for me in my 20 years in youth work, so I'm aware of the issues. Yeah, I'm delighted to see finally all of us have been looking for these kind of guidelines are in place. I suppose just a number of kind of things there. Just I suppose what's in the best interest of the child, I think, is paramount. I think in my research that would show up that sometimes there's a competing rights agenda there between the majority students versus a single student. Also, it's very hard to have that what's in the best interest of the child. How do you compete with like a child being isolated from school, you know, being rejected, that sense of rejection out of social recreational activities, etc. in school. So that certainly is a kind of an issue there. My preference would be, from my research, I think there would always be an in-school reduced timetable to stop particularly with a level of disengagement or a bit of, you know, removal from the whole structure and routine of school. So that would be something that would need to be adequately resourced. In terms of the evidence, and just a couple of notes here from the Minister's speech, in terms of the evidence, it would be really interesting. I took a whole community approach as opposed to a particular cohort of students. So like challenging behavior, for example, is at the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Skills and Reduced Timetables is the most cited rationale for reduced timetables. But actually there's extensive research to show that there's no clear one definition of what challenging behavior is. So we're into an arena possibly there of who's going to say what evidence is. There's thresholds, there's all sorts of things in that, teachers' own dispositions, their own thresholds to behaviors, the school's resources. So there's a number of factors in that. And then you're crossing into what Niall Muldoon, the Children's Ombuds, calls the pseudo-judicial role of schools, where they're actively making those decisions where there's no technical thing. In relation to the monitoring, I absolutely welcome it. I suppose, look, having been from a professional point of view, not a research point of view, I know sometimes how quickly these reduced timetables can happen. They can be gone, they're very dynamic. There's no real-time data. They can be a week on, week off, 2 days, 3 days. I think already schools are swamped with reporting. So unless there was something like an online portal system that they have in the UK, where literally it has to go up online straight away, I'd kind of be curious if there's an onerous reporting on off of every child on a reduced timetable. You know, I welcome the monitoring, I welcome the support. I certainly think families and parents, children who are in disadvantaged areas will certainly need support. And they may also need other advocates, because professionals like the EWS may be seen as another layer of professionals that they may not necessarily have trusting relationships with. Trying to hit all the things that you kind of said. I don't know if that hits some of your queries, Tanya, but
no, that's great. So what I'm taking from that, Mairead, is there's a real need to look at what the best interests of children are, and we need to be able to guide schools. I mean, it's a really interesting point, because it's one of the big international critiques of what is the best interest, because what one person will decide will be very different to another. So you really need to guide the professional about how they make that decision. But the other piece is that challenging behaviour. What is it? What's acceptable? And guiding schools in how they manage the situation. But the other piece is also the resourcing and how it's implemented. And it strikes me that the online portal, something like that, is going to be critical, because schools are already overburdened with reporting, a lot of administrative work. And it's a challenging environment in the post-COVID world, or an in-COVID world, as we're schools are still dealing with.
There was one point I just meant to say on just the resources as well. A big issue in my research was the lack of transition of resources from primary to secondary, that schools have to reapply for SNAs, tutors and all like that the following March. So just to say that the resources should follow the child in that transition, not follow the school.
Okay. Thanks for that, Mairead. Adam, I might move to you, and let's say looking at what does this mean for children and young people, and what supports do you think that they're going to need?
Well, I think this is obviously very welcome that we have this announcement. I think it's worth saying, you mentioned earlier, Tanya, that we don't perhaps know the scale of the problem, and I think that's very true. Certainly as an organisation, what we have seen though over the last year is significant evidence that this is a practice that's on the increase, which is obviously particularly concerning when we consider that the young people who are very often being placed on reduced timetables are the same cohort of young people who are most disadvantaged by COVID-19, who are often unable to learn online, who often had significant challenges, for example, in engaging in self-regulation in the home. And so the transition back to the classroom is going to be very significant. We would have published a report called Invisible Children 3 years ago, which documented the cases of 330 young people who weren't participating in school on a day-to-day basis full time. 17% of those young people were on reduced timetables, and some of those young people were as young as 4 or 5 years old. So I think it shows the scale of the problem. But interestingly, in a joint study with Down Syndrome Ireland and Inclusion Ireland last year, we saw that prior to COVID-19, in terms of our respondents, about 8% of the population surveyed had been on a reduced timetable. But this survey was conducted, I think it was in September, and that had risen to 14% had a conversation about a reduced timetable since school reopened. So I think it is really timely and vital that these resources are implemented. For me, in hearing about the proposed guidelines, there's two key concerns that I have this morning. I suppose the first thing is that in Ireland, we write beautiful policy documents. And if I think about all of the legislation that underpins the rights of people with disabilities in Ireland, and the fact that much of that legislation continues to be not commenced, I would have the same concern about these guidelines. And the first question that will come into my mind this morning is, what happens if these guidelines are ignored on the ground or aren't appropriately adhered to? We would be very conscious of the speed reduced timetables have been put in place, in some cases on the first day of the new academic year. And in addition, what we would be concerned about is, particularly when intersectionality is involved, the power dynamic that can exist between schools and families when these sort of issues emerge. So I think what's really important is that we understand what recourse families have when situations like this do occur, but also the families are able to access advice very early on their journey about what happens and what their entitlements are. But I guess where I would bring things to today, I think fundamentally, is that when we are talking about rights and we're talking about regulating reduced timetables, we must think about a bigger point that the department makes. And consistently, the department says, we don't feel the need to implement the Exon Act because we're bringing it in via circular. But as long as we have a scenario where students with additional needs do not have rights to the supports they need to manage in school, we're going to continue to return to this situation. And finally, I think in terms of data collection, I think there's two pieces that are very important. I think it's vitally important that the data that is collected is disaggregated, that we're not just looking at reduced timetables as a whole and the number of students, but we're capturing the profile of those students as well. I think that's absolutely critical. But linked to that we understand reduced timetables as an ecosystem. We've seen many cases where what starts as a reduced timetable or isolation in school often escalates to suspension or expulsion. But unfortunately, at that stage, what can happen is recourse for families can break down because it's not clear, does a Section 29 committee, does a court, does the ombudsman have remit to resolve the issue? So I think it's very clear that we look at this as an ecosystem and we put the protections in at an ecosystem level.
Okay, thanks for that, Adam. Particularly when being reminded is, I suppose, the need for a legislative basis for this area, because you can have a rollback implementation space. But I think what's really striking, I suppose, is the focus on the ecosystem. What supports will parents get? What supports will schools get? And I think the other point that really jumps out for me is this disaggregated data, and really getting a picture what's happening to which child, where, which school, to which cohort, etc. That's going to be really critical to understand the implementation piece, and what happens if a school doesn't respond to the guidelines. What's going to happen to them then? So I think that's a really, really important point there. Bernard, can I go to you, I suppose, from the ITM's experience, and alongside children with disabilities, traveller children, one of the other cohorts of children and young people who are really impacted by this. I mean, what's been your experience for children and young people? And I suppose from the guidelines point of view, or I suppose what kind of support do you think children and families need in this space?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tanya. And maybe just to say as well, like the other panelists, obviously welcome the Minister's input this morning. And in some ways, it's also probably helped, is if the Minister was to stay on, we would have had a further conversation. But just in terms of the experience, like the reduced times, we know that's certainly disproportionate in terms of impact, and that in addition to that, the reduced times doesn't allow children to follow the full curriculum. It also impacts on children's well-being in terms of participation, engagement, and being, feeling that they're a full part of the school in terms of school community. It also has a disproportionate impact because we also know that in terms of the expectations in schools of travel children can be low, and there's evidence there. And we are obviously concerned that there may be different underlying issues that give rise to children being on reduced times, and whether it's biased or prejudice that exist in terms of low expectations and attainment and outcomes for traveller children. So we're deeply concerned about that, and we're also concerned about the lack of data that's currently there, in terms of showing that. And I think that's very much what some of the other panelists have said. So we're certainly concerned about the overall misuse of the reduced timetables. In addition to that, we'd also be concerned about supports. That is there supports going in, and where are those supports? And that gives rise then to the level in terms of outcomes. And we already know there's extremely poor outcomes for travellers in terms of education, and only 1% going to full level education. So a lot of people last week, students and parents, were, probably, had some of the highest results in terms of leaving cert. But for many as well who would be on reduced times, this would be a completely different experience and a different challenge, because they're never going to get that level of points. And I personally, as a traveller, as a parent, I'm really disturbed, Tanya, by the reduced times, and I'm disturbed by the length that reduced times are in place. So it's not acting in the interest of children. And in some ways it's acting in the interest of schools or education, or the mass. So you're looking at 3 years, possibly 4 years, or even further on for full school, full life experience of either post-primary or primary in terms of reduced times. And the question then is, even with the guidelines, how is that going to affect children who's already gone through it? Because to me, there's a generation of children now, traveller children, and others who have lost out in terms of education, in terms of opportunity, and further progression. So I'm certainly really concerned about that. The guidelines themselves are guidelines, and I think what we would be really asking for is that there's eradication of reduced times. Like, we know in the Constitution that there's a legal and constitutional obligation to every single child, regardless of your background or your religion, your ethnicity, to a full-time education. Now, of course, there can be times where circumstances, you know, have to be called in terms of, you know, emergencies or children coming out of hospital and there's a reintegration. We understand that, but it's just how this is being completely abused in a way that is not serving the interest of those children. It does need, I think, I haven't seen the guidelines, so so we don't know the detail that's there. And I think we would obviously, one, welcome the guidelines, but also there has to be an accountability, and there has to be segregation, there has to be data, there has to be monitoring and implementation. And there has to be rules for the inspectoral role within that. And I think that's really, really important. And obviously TUSLA and others. So in this case, we've been asking for that, and we've been asking for this robust system to be put in place. And there has to be monitored in terms of the the reduction and elimination of reduced times, and where that is happening, the resources need to be put in terms of supporting those children.
Thanks for that, Bernard. I mean, I'm really struck by, I suppose, the emotion in what you're saying as well, in terms of what you're seeing among the traveller community. And the thing that, it's a bigger question probably for the education system, but this issue of having low expectations for children and low aspirations for children, and making decisions about what a child's future should be. There's a bigger question about how we shift that in the education system and how we change that. But I think you've also raised, you really put it up to us, should we be eradicating reduced timetables altogether? Why is it part of the education approach at all? I think that's something we do need to actually ask ourselves on this panel discussion. Does it actually have a role within the education system? You've also asked about the role of the inspectorate, and I did see in the question and answers that question has come from Janet Colgan as well. She said the Minister didn't mention the inspectorate, the main body responsible for quality in teaching, and what impact did the panel feel giving inspectors a role in monitoring of implementation from a pedagogical point of view. I don't know, Deborah or Dibna or Mairead, do you want to respond to that? And I was going to then pass to Sandra then for a follow-up question, just on the role of the inspectorate in relation to reduced timetables. What monitoring roles should they have, do you think? Who wants to come in?
Well, I'll just say briefly, I know that the EWS, it's certainly something, or sorry, TESS, I keep saying EWS, TESS is something that they certainly have been looking, because they don't feel that they're in examining the schools, that they can't see the practice. So they want, I know that TESS have actually been saying they want the schools inspector to be their eyes and ears on practice. It's back to your bigger point, Tanya, about the siloed nature of policy and government departments. Having TESS and TUSLA and Department of Education, they didn't necessarily come together. So I hope now TESS are with the inspectorate. I would really like to see, the inspector taking a more proactive role and working more closely with TESS. That would be my view.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that, Mairead. Dibna.
Hi, yeah, sorry, and apologies for joining late, folks. So just specifically into the inspectorate, I mean, I think the issue here would be around whole school evaluations and the kind of criteria that would be used when inspectors are doing the whole school evaluations, because unless something is actually written into an area that needs to be commented on in a whole school evaluation, then it's very difficult. It kind of makes it much more visible.
Okay, so we need the question on the whole school evaluation template as well. Yeah, to pad it down.
kind of links into issues around equality and inclusion and diversity being a fundamental aspect of the whole school evaluations. And I might add, not just in DESH schools, in all schools.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ditna. Sandra, can I move to you? I suppose I wanted to ask you, I mean, a big part of the discussion has been about the kind of supports that schools actually need, and perhaps reduced timetables. It's a manifestation of something else that could be happening within the education system. What's your perspective on it?
Well, I suppose, first of all, just to come back on the last piece and the inspectorate, there is a possible role around incidental inspections by the inspectorate, particularly when that data begins to accrue and is disaggregated, that if there are particular schools that maybe are leaning on this measure more than what would be expected, then perhaps, incidental inspections by the inspectorate would be, something that might be useful. So, but just to come back to your question, Tanya, like the evidence at the moment is all, to use that word, anecdotal, but it's so sad actually to hear the testimony and to read the testimony that is in reports that Inclusion Ireland and As I Am, and we've heard from Bernard this morning from the ITN. Like, we did a survey just in the last month of our schools going back. Over half of them participated in the survey, and over 70% of the schools said they are understaffed when it comes to meeting the needs of children and young people with additional educational needs, and that's significantly understaffed. So, the higher investment in supports by the department is welcome, but it's absolutely necessary, and it's not enough. But for us, from our point of view, we're a network, an inclusive network of schools that is child-centered at its core. And our schools are trying to be child-centered, but they're really struggling. Over half of our schools are developing, so that means that their numbers are increasing year on year. And for developing schools, they are not being given a fair proportion of the allocation of resources, but they are getting and it's not an unfair, but they tend to be what are called magnet schools. So parents have a perception that their child is going to get a better and more focused, attention in a school that has smaller numbers. We'd like to think that that's also our inclusive model is a contributory decision for those families. But our schools are really struggling because they're not given a fair allocation of resources compared to their counterparts. So, really, the department are going to have to grasp this nettle at some point. There is an unfair allocation of resources in the system, and that there may be very well educated together schools who also have an unfair allocation to their benefit. And there needs to be a rebalancing in the system to make sure that schools that have, the greatest need have the greatest amount of resources. So we asked our schools, like, what are they doing? So if they don't have enough staff, what are they doing? Thankfully, no, not one of the schools mentioned they're using reduced hours as a measure. So that's heartening. Now that's not to say that they're not, but nobody mentioned that. But what they are doing is they're trying to cram as much resources to the students with the highest need as possible. Now, and that's good. However, what about the children who still have needs but don't have the highest need? They are children whose needs are not currently being met. We have a lack of therapeutic services and supports for our schools. Schools cannot get access to these really, really important services. And I know TUSLA are also under-resourced. They don't have enough, staff. They don't have, there's so many schools and so many staff in EWO. So the guidelines are really, really welcome, but the department needs to do more than produce guidelines. The schools need to be supported to implement those guidelines in a way that is really, in the best interests of the child. And just one example of what a project that we're running at the moment with about a third of our schools, it's a nurture approach. And what that what that does is, so a child who is struggling in the classroom, what that will happen is that child will get attention in the school. It is outside the classroom, but it's with trained staff in a one-to-one or a small, number environment for a very short period of time, maximum of 4 terms. And the evidence from that approach is that those children are back full-time in the classroom, supported, getting better engaged, better outcomes, better attendance, better everything. And the department, it'd be great if the department would support approaches like that are alternatives to putting a child on reduced timetable. So they're the kind of things that I think are needed. But also what is needed is that a rebalancing of the children across the system. That there's lots of schools that don't have children with additional educational needs, or there's certainly a higher proportion of schools that are new or developing that have a higher proportion of children with additional educational needs. We welcome those children, don't get me wrong, but there needs to be a campaign of information for parents to say that now with the Admissions Act, you can send your child to your local school. You don't have to travel across, miles to go to a specialized school for your child. You can go to your local school. And I think that needs to happen more and more. And maybe the resources then will get more balanced out in the system.
Tanya, just to say, the circulars 33 and 32, which were published on the 31st of August, both contain a section on reduced timetables that might be of interest to viewers, that talks about what inspectors will look for during incidental inspections this year. And that includes evidence of a plan is in place if a child is in a reduced timetable for how that will be reduced over time. So that just might be a useful tool for people listening, and something to draw people's attention to.
So it's already captured in the circular in the incidental inspection piece. It's already there. Yeah. That's really welcome to see that.
Can I also just come back? I saw a comment from somebody in the chat. Actually, they were saying quite rightly that there is already a system where the department can use to track reduced hours, and that's the online claim system. So that where schools already have to input things like attendance and so on. So there doesn't actually need, they could be collecting that data currently,
Yeah, if they use existing systems. What struck me, Sandra, there as well, I mean, I think this is coming in a context where schools, certainly in the developmental phase, feel they're not getting enough resources, that schools with children with additional needs feel that they're not getting sufficient resources, and that there's this underlying imbalance within the education system at the minute, where some children, and certainly we've come across this in the Children's Rights Alliance from schools, telling us that the school has said it's full, there's different reasons why the child can't access their school, and they apply to the new school and they suddenly get a place. That there are other inequalities with how children with additional needs are being dealt with. Deborah, can I move to you, I suppose, and I know you've done research in this space as well. What do you think that the schools need, and what children and young people need in the implementation phase of these guidelines?
Thanks, Tanya. Well, I suppose I agree with everything that's been said so far, but 2 things stood out to me there in terms of the implementation. One of them is the consent of parents. So the consent of parents will always be sought. In our research, we discovered that more than half of parents felt under pressure from the school. And we know that there's a dynamic that goes on. Adam's spoken at length about this on other occasions between parents and schools. So there's a pressure point there. And I'm concerned about that. And I'm also concerned about the school producing evidence. For any of us who've seen Section 29 reports, we'll know that in very many cases, that evidence is flimsy, unusual, etc. So the nature of the evidence, how the evidence is gathered by the school would be of concern to me. And the other thing that I think is incredibly important, we talk about challenging behaviour all of the time, but behaviour is very often co-constructed. We need to talk about the behaviour of the school. It's very, very easy, and again, coming down to the evidence, it's very easy to provoke a child and I'll be provocative in using the word provoke, it's very easy to provoke a child who has a tendency towards reacting in a certain way if you want to manufacture evidence. Now that might sound outlandish, but I think that many of us are very aware that that is an occurrence. So we may actually be putting more pressure on families and children in a well-intentioned move there. Just in relation to data, and just to answer Adam's point earlier, which I found very interesting, the disaggregated data. I actually have quite a lot of disaggregated data, but one point, and not all of it is published, one point I'd like to just draw people's attention to is that very often we're looking to see what type of child in what environment, and what child is affected, who is it that's being affected. A very interesting pattern emerged in our data collection, which was the same child in a different school can have a very different circumstance. So very often moving the child to another setting, and when I say another setting, this may be mainstream to mainstream, special school to special school, special class to special class, you can have a very different outcome. And another thing is change of staff in a school can produce a different outcome. So we have to, I suppose, be careful to not see, and I agree with the other panelists, that generally it's something to do with behaviour is a reason cited for these restrictions on timetables. Very often it's behaviour or resource to manage behaviour, which is still behaviour in itself. But that behaviour may be different in a different circumstance, and we have to be very careful not to locate that behaviour always in the child.
And Tanya, just to come in there, just on that point, the point that I was making earlier on is not the behaviour of the child, it can be the behaviour of the structures in the system. And in this case, it can be in terms of that bias, in terms of that low expectation of a traveller student or pupil. And therefore, being put on a reduced time doesn't require any additional resources in some cases. It's the very nature that they're a traveller and it's their ethnicity. And that's the concern that we're highlighting. And it becomes more prominent, not in primary, but actually in post-primary education, where the hours start to reduce in terms of that transition from primary over to post-primary. We're talking to others, it may be in the primary school where the reduced hours is, more evident. And at the same time, it is really I find it really, shocking and surprising that there isn't clear evidence and research done in this area, given the amount of testimonies, the amount of evidence, the experience of anecdotal of parents. And the point I'd heard you saying, Deborah, is that the consent, and within the traveller community, the consent given to by a parent is the belief that this reduced time is in the interest of their child's welfare, well-being, and education. And we know, again, evidently, that is not the case. And just to highlight to people, during this, from the 60s right up to the 90s, and in some cases right to the present day, the word special has a very demeaning, the word special education doesn't give travellers much confidence. I don't know about others, but it certainly doesn't give travellers much confidence, because travellers have been put in what would be described as special education for merely being a member of the traveller community, for no other reason. And that education in terms of, classrooms, separate schools, specialised supports, has absolutely had a disproportionate impact. And for parents, there's a trauma in terms of that level. And that was actually institutionalized racism. That was, it was institutionalized racism, and which impacted on a high level of members of the traveller community. And I think as parents going forward, we certainly don't want to see that decoded or disguised in another way in terms of travellers. But we also don't want to see it happen in terms of any other group. It's just not acceptable. And I think we have to call it out, and we have to be very strong in it. And there is no, I don't believe there's any justification to not have a very clear, tangible plan, consultation, dialogue, with parents and children to ensure the best interest of the child is supported with the resources that needs to be there. And if I hear the minister say there's 2 billion being invested, the question we're asking is, where's that 2 billion being invested so we can actually see it in terms of the needs and supports currently there? Because at the moment, we don't know how much is being allocated specifically for travel education. We have no idea, we have no idea in terms of some of the supports. And I think we'd like, there needs to be kind of a more transparency and a breakdown of how that is actually being, allocated.
Tanya, can I just jump in there with something?
Yeah, I know Adam has his hand up there first, Mairead. Would that be okay if I go to Adam and then go to yourself? Yeah, Adam.
Just, I really think this point about parental consent is going to be vital if these guidelines are to be worth their salt, because I think what I would be concerned about is that increasing the rights around parental consent with reduced timetables without tackling the issues around suspension and expulsion may in actual fact see an increase in inappropriate suspension. And I think that is something that we have to be so aware of. Last year, we would have seen literal scenarios where parents were met at the door of a school and said, unless you agree to collect your child at a certain time today, they cannot enter the building, which to me is just reminiscent of a very, very different time and context. And I think we have to think about if a parent consents, but it's in the context of if you don't, we will use a punitive measure, which will use language that implies that a child is choosing to behave in a certain way, which is fundamentally perhaps their way of communicating, their way of self-regulating or not being able to self-regulate, and is inextricably linked to their diagnosis. I think that's totally unacceptable, and it's very much linked to a failure in the context of the UN Convention, because we can't have a situation where people are essentially punished for having a disability. And I think what this links to as well is the memberships of boards of management. Boards of management will play a huge role if that happens in terms of determining suspension and expulsion. And often we're dealing with people who have no understanding or no training around this regard. So I think it is a mistake to only reform parental consent around reduced timetables without really going back to the Education Welfare Act and saying, is it acceptable to punish people for communicating and experiencing the classroom in a different way to other people?
Thanks for that, Adam. And it picks up, I mean, I really like the approach Deborah had in that we should be focusing more on the education setting and how the education setting responds to the child instead of just focusing on the child. And I think you're picking that piece up here. Mairead, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah,
you might expand on that as well, about how does the education setting, how do we put the onus on the education setting? What does the education setting look like in a school that doesn't misuse reduced timetables?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of, there's a theme between what Deborah said, Adam said, and Bernard. Yeah, I mean, the thing is about that co-constructed behavior is absolutely correct. I mean, participants in my research, and this is the point about having the voice of the child very clearly centered, but they certainly would have had a lot of derogatory language about their area, about their families, about their futures. And I agree with Adam, even where there was parental consent or guardian consent, grandparents, and they overturned the reduced timetables, there was another covert kind of teacher refusals, other kind of things then took place for those individual children. So we do need to be careful about that. Yeah, but certainly in a classroom setting, I mean, again, where you have a high turnover of teachers, a lack of teachers, and young people come in, and there certainly has been, in my research and other studies, a lot of evidence to show that there's issues of trauma there. There's a lot of other things play out in that classroom setting, to the point to which the behavior is always, with the power dynamic, goes back to the child, and the child is excluded. But when it comes then to the consent, then the whole point is then the behavior gets labeled, well, look, the child can't cope, they're going to be expelled. So in order to not be expelled, we're going to put them on this reduced timetable in their best interest. You may have parents with literacy issues, you may have parents with educational disadvantages that they then think this is the answer, or they may not have the resources, or they may not have the wherewithal. So yeah, it is a cycle that goes round and round. And for actually in my research as well, a lot of the parents had been in the same schools themselves and had the same experiences, so they did not feel they had the wherewithal to stand up and in these scenarios.
The parental piece, it's a huge issue, because I think what you're kind of describing there, Mairead, is it's nearly a form of soft coercion, that the parent has a choice: suspension or expulsion versus reduced timetables. And how does a parent who's already struggling manage that?
Yeah.
Dipna, you have your hand up. Sorry, I think Sandra was first, then Dipna, and then Deborah.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to, throw in there also around, the co-constructive behavior thing. Like in a child-centered approach to education, you look at behavior as communication. Now, if we apply that same principle to a school, and a school that is using reduced hours, their behavior is not as is expected. And we have to look at why are they behaving in that way. Now, there's very few schools, or hopefully there's none, who don't have the best interests of the child at their heart. So we have to look at what are they struggling with as a school, that they feel they have to recourse, to something as extreme as that. And we really have to listen to our schools. We have to listen to the teachers, the principals, who are crying out saying, we don't have a fair allocation of resources. The department have some excellent initiatives, such as there was a pilot of the social inclusion model, which had wraparound services for schools like speech and language therapists, all these therapeutic services. Now, that has yet to be evaluated. In the evaluation, we will, see where the gaps are, and that would allow them then to maybe roll that inclusion model out that has been shown in the schools that were involved in the pilot to be really, really successful. We need to follow through on things, And the second thing is that the system for the allocation of additional needs for schools is not working for a particular cohort of schools. That needs to be changed. And it needs to be, as I say, a fairer allocation of resources. We do have really good, high quality teacher education. And there are, colleges of education that have really good models of inclusive education that would focus on, the teacher understanding maybe their privilege, the fact that they're privileged, and they may be teaching children who are not so privileged, and how can they be better, inclusive practitioners, taking into account things like trauma and all that kind of stuff. However, it doesn't get enough time, in the colleges of education. And that's not the fault of the colleges of education. It's the focus on literacy, numeracy. We need an integrated approach to how we teach teachers, and we need to give more teachers access to that high quality education. We have solutions. We just need to apply them.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sandra. Dipna, and then Deborah.
Thanks for that, Tanya. Sorry, I was muted there. It's just kind of to build on what Mairead was saying there, and also some of the other panel discussants. I mean, one of the things that's been quite shocking in terms of the really good qualitative work that Mairead has done in these core post-primary schools, which is relatively neglected in terms of this kind of research, is the intergenerational dimension to this. To look at the experiences of the parents and their own trauma, often contextual, obviously, but also in terms of their own interactions with the school system, and not having the confidence, the resources, the know-how to articulate and advocate for their children. But there were also examples in that research of a school where the reduced timetable had actually worked to the benefit of the child at that particular time. The problem is when it becomes institutionalized as a response. Bernard, you talked about traveller children. So this is where you get underlying dynamics of racism, prejudice, classism, etc. in the system that becomes prominent in times of acute stress within schools. It's not in any way to legitimate it, but it's actually really, really important to name it. A key issue also is the transition from primary to post-primary. In the wider Children's School Life study, the longitudinal study of primary schools in Ireland, we put in one question actually just to see how to the forefront this issue of reduced timetables even was within the primary school system. And within that, we found that principals, about just under 1/4 of principals indicated that there was some form of reduced timetabling going on in their schools. A very, very small amount, but nonetheless it existed. We need more research in that in terms of what's happening and how it's happening in primary level. But absolutely key is the transition from primary to post-primary, because we know the system of post-primary is different. We know that there are struggles to make it a more student-centered system rather than exam-centered system. And so kids who struggled at primary level get totally lost in the post-primary system if there isn't that kind of positive transition there. So there's just some key issues there, I think. But the intergenerational dimension is really a huge concern in terms of this is something that's affecting families over periods of generations. It's not just once off happening to a child.
I mean, that's really interesting, Dipna, because, you know, we see that in the child poverty statistics, this notion of persistent poverty, intergenerational poverty. So obviously Mairead's research is picking that up and the impact that it's having on children and young people in the next generation. Deborah, can I go to you? And then I know Bernard has his hand up, and then I want to go just to a few of the questions in the question answers box that's come to us. Deborah, you're still on silent there.
Sorry, Tanya. Yeah, but most of my points were actually covered by the two previous speakers there. But I thought maybe I would just say a little bit about the data that we do have, just to explain it, because a number of people have mentioned numbers. And in fact, it's quite coincident with Dipna's number there. So 2 years ago, we collected some data. We did it in a standard format, which is, you know, we accessed about 0.5% of the parents or guardians of children with disabilities currently in education in the Republic of Ireland. So that would give us statistical significance. So although that is data that is gathered from parents, it's not necessarily anecdotal data. It would be considered robust data because it's 0.5%. So the schools weren't gathering the data. So to just let you know, we disaggregated that data as well, to let you know that over the course of the child's school career, we measured, we took children from junior infants to the end of secondary school, to their leaving point in secondary school. So this data shows us to this point. So some of the children in the survey would be 4, some would be 18. So some may be yet to experience the phenomenon, if you like. So this would be an underestimate of the numbers. So what we discovered in this, that is approximately 1/4 of children, well, quite almost accurately, 1/4 of children with a disability, which would be a disability, and we looked at the disabilities, these are significant disabilities. So the leading one is autism, or intellectual disability, physical sensory disabilities. 1/4 had experienced a reduced timetable at some stage in their career thus far. That rose to 1/3 for children whose diagnosis involved autism. It was higher for boys than for girls. It was almost half of boys with a diagnosis of autism or part of their diagnosis. Within that data, so that is fairly robust. And I mean, what I would say about that data is that it was skewed towards the settled white Irish population. It was skewed, clearly it was done online. It was clear it was skewed towards people who were literate and computer literate as well. So we can estimate that the data, if anything, is higher. The statistics are higher than those numbers. Now, it must be said that not all of those reduced timetables were illegal, approximately half of them. So we get down to about 1/8 of children with a disability had a reduced timetable thus far in their career that was potentially, well, that didn't satisfy the report as reported by their parents, the guidelines given by the government for suspensions at that time, because there were no other guidelines. So in other words, those suspensions or short school suspensions had a duration of longer than 20 days, for example. Very many of the children affected had a very short day, and the shortest that we came across were traveller children, in fact, with about 40 minutes to an hour attendance. in a school day in some cases. So we do actually have that data. What was very significant is that the majority of parents, even though they agreed, felt under pressure. And in the majority of the cases, the parents were at least not aware of an outside agency being contacted. So to just give a brief background of what the data is, it is very significant and it does occur. And you can expect, if your child has a disability, that it will be, there's about a 25% chance of having a reduced timetable and about a 1 in 8 chance of that not, well, being at least in a legal grey area.
Well, that's striking, Deborah. I mean, there's real parallels, I think, with the data that Dibna is uncovering with yourself.
Yeah.
But to also hear, you know, as little as 40 minutes a day for a child, I mean, that's pretty shocking. If that's on an extended period of time, you've really changed the life of that child.
You have, and there's another very significant thing is that where the day is truncated, in other words, just the child needs to leave an hour early. If that child, particularly in secondary school, they may be missing a different subject every day in doing that, which has an impact across all of their subjects. And that occurs very often, as Bernard would know, with Traveller children.
Thanks, Deborah. Can I pass on to Bernard then?
Yeah, I think it's probably just a follow up, Deborah, from what you're saying. And I think that, you know, people seem to think that maybe, you know, once you have evidence, that proves it, or that's sufficient enough. And the fact is, Travellers and other groups have been saying this for many, many years. And I would like to think that schools have the best interest. All schools have the best interest. You know, but when you talk to parents and you talk to, you look at history, it's not the case. It's not evident. And it's only recently enough that children have been allowed to attend mainstream education from the Traveller community, and Traveller special schools have been closed down in terms of segregation. So that's a legacy, but it's also a dark part of history within an Irish context, where Traveller children based on their ethnicity were segregated, separated. And even where there was mainstream education, I just want people who's listening in to know that there were schools where they had white lines in which a Traveller child could not cross that white line. And that wasn't like 100 years ago. It wasn't in Alabama. It wasn't in South Africa. It was in Dublin, and it was in other parts of the country. So when you look at the education, and then you look at the the education system, and then you look at the population, in which Travellers only until 2017 were denied their ethnicity. And for the first time, this was one of the longest campaigns, by the way, 30 years, in which we had to campaign to be seen, and recognized, and that's where we're at. So now we're at a stage where we believe that education is people tell us we're not interested in education. We don't believe in education. So why are we here fighting for education? Why are we campaigning for our children to be in full-time education? And there's something flawed about that. And then we have to show, and then we have to go through the experience of, trauma of having to reflect on the past and bring it back to the front again. I think that's fundamentally wrong. But where we're at is, and I would like to think that schools, yes, have the best interest, but from the experience, they don't, whether it's the principal, whether it's the board, whether it's schools tunneling Traveller children into, high populations of Traveller children into DESH schools. And by the way, only half the Traveller children are in DESH schools, the other half are in other schools. And I would argue the point, it's not about schools getting more resources, it's about children getting more resources, regardless of what school you're in. The resources should be tailored towards the child's needs. And if you're talking about a child-centered education approach, that's what it should be. It's not about the whole school. It's about ensuring that child is supported. And therefore, we need to frame this in a different light, in a human rights framework, and to ensure that no child should lose out based on their learning, based on their ethnicity, based on their color, their religion, and their beliefs. And I think for too long, I think there is that element that there are certain core groups who are just at the very bottom, And when you look at where travellers are in terms of employment, 80% of travellers are unemployed, like, 82% actually. So that doesn't make a good grounding in terms of future prospects of careers, opportunities, employment. And it seems to be a bit of a flinch. So there has to be a kind of, like I would say, Tanya, just because you're sharing this, a no government approach and looking at this, so that it's a rights-based approach. And also, I just want to just sort of for others mention that I can make reference to this in the message book, the OCO report in Children's Ombudsman, where children are coming from substandard, inhumane conditions, from conditions that you just would not accept or be, seen in any other part of society. And I'm not saying that anybody should, but I think it's up to people to just step up and say that's, wrong. It's, it's not right. And, they're not just traveller children, there are children. And there needs to be a standard. So what I'd be saying is that then you go to school, having come from this, inhumane conditions, and then put into, reduced times for those 40 minutes. There's absolutely no opportunity. And I think that, I'm absolutely furious and angry that it's just allowed to fester to such a degree that it becomes just, another glossy element. So we need to kind of, really address this, but it has to be monitored, and it has to be the minister really stepping up and, and saying, we need to address this once and for all. And that's what we're saying about eradication, that because it should be a bit of resources. But anyway, I think that's important, but I don't believe all schools, I just don't believe all schools have the best interest of children.
Okay, thanks, Bernard. I mean, and you completely get that because of the experience of the children and young people and the families that you're working with, that has come true. I mean, what you're describing is just, discrimination and racism at all levels, and there is a need for a multifaceted approach in relation to this issue. Marie, did you want to come in there? And I've got one question I want to put to the panel, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Thanks. It's a very quick point actually about the monitoring of just something that came up in my research as well. Is quite often when a reduced timetable was being put in place, it was also bookended with unofficial suspensions, although reduced timetables, disciplinary reduced timetables. So if you're monitoring, so actually some people who are on a reduced timetable could have been out far more because the schools would sort of suspend them, reduce their time. So there was a kind of a rolling move between the two practices unofficially. So there would be 2 days out. It didn't have to be notified to tests. So it's just, as well to make sure that it's the practice and whatever else went around it is also being monitored. Just another thing just around data collection, just about young people on reduced timetables. Some of the participants in my research, because they were on in post-primary school, because they were on reduced timetables, maybe pre-junior cert, were then not allowed by the school to do their LCE, the traditional leaving cert, because the school told them they had missed time and core subjects. So it's just to say that, the tracking has to have a longitudinal element as well, just about how it's been used, what it's been used, and just that it's not just the snapshot of this was a 2-week reduced timetable, a moment in time, or, so it's just that as Adam and other people have called for a rounder data collection and evidence base for the practice.
We need that if we're really going to uncover what's happening. There is a question coming through on fetal alcohol. We've answered most of the rest of them, but there's one coming from Annie Nugent in relation to diagnosed or suspected fetal alcohol spectrum. I think she's pointing to the fact that many children who've experienced this in the womb are actually experiencing reduced timetables as a result. And she's suggesting that it's actually twice as prevalent as autism in Ireland. Does anyone want to respond to that? Deborah, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that there may be an issue here in general in relation to diagnosis. And I noticed that in the chat earlier, there was a question regarding assessment of need. And I think there has been a move away from assessment of need and a greater onus on the school to identify learning needs. And I think that is really a problem. It was introduced, the idea of moving away from assessment of need. The idea was really intended to be a beneficial move. So because children from more affluent social groups were tending to get more allocation of resources. So it was intended to be a fairer move. But when you have something that is not very well understood, and I have to say I don't understand fetal alcohol spectrum disorder myself, but when you have something that's very considered rare or not understood or whatever, it can be very difficult for schools to separate that from normal behavioural issues, in fairness to schools, and they do need support there. So yeah. I think assessment of need is a major.
It's key. It's key. Okay, thanks for that, Deborah. So look, I'm just going to wrap up the discussion at this point. I mean, I really want to thank the panel for a really wide-ranging discussion, and I think the intervention of the Minister for State, Josepha Manigan, was really key for kicking off our discussion. And obviously, it's really welcome to hear that those guidelines and reduced timetables are about to be published and that it's imminent. And what really struck me about our discussion here was we got a real sense of what the issues are going to be around implementation. You know, there's concern about, we now have the policy, and you can see from the chat that a lot of different organisations, representative organisations, have been looking for these guidelines for quite some time. But there's concern about the gap between the policy and the implementation piece. And because it's so widespread and involves so many different groups of children and different types of schools, the response is, because there's a very significant response needed as a backup to the guidelines. What really struck me in the monitoring piece is obviously the role of the inspectorate that it will play in supporting TUSLA and the education welfare officers. I mean, I'm always surprised at the low number we have of welfare officers in Ireland. It's really just scratching the surface if we're really trying to give children, to ensure that children are held onto in the education system. But the other piece coming through is the monitoring of it, you know, that there's no gaps in terms of the documentation piece, that other practices that might be contributing to it should be picked up as well, and a rounder an analysis of what's going on. There was some really good points about the best interest principle. How is that going to be implemented in practice? Behaviours, the definition of challenging behaviours. It would strike me that training is going to be, clarification on definitions and training is going to be key. But the other piece coming through and shining through is trying to, while we should be monitoring the number of children experiencing this and where it's happening, we should also be flipping the focus onto the schools in which this is happening as well. What kind of strategies are they using that's resulting in children ending up on reduced timetables? And that's where the focus should be. And a big question around resources to schools. Are schools getting enough resources? Is this a symptom of this underlying issue with the way schools are managing the situation as well? It really struck me as well was around, I suppose, the role of parents in this space, and I'd add children and young people as well. There's a feeling that many parents feel coerced into agreeing to reduced timetables, and that's something we really need to look at. We really need to educate parents on what their children's rights and entitlements are in the space, and they need scaffolding and support in relation to this. So that's really key in the follow-up, but also for those children and young people themselves who are experiencing this, that they are gotten to in terms of what their rights and entitlements are, and getting the support they need if this is happening to them within the school system. The other theme coming through, and it really struck me, was you have a combination, as Bernard and Adam described, sometimes segregation is actually happening for some groups of children. And alongside that is these low expectations and aspirations for children. And there seems to be a culture potentially, and also around socioeconomic status as well. It strikes me that there is a review happening of the Equal Status Acts at the moment. We don't have the definition of socioeconomic grounds. This could be a great opportunity to get the ground of socioeconomic status included, because we know a lot of discrimination in Ireland happens on the basis of class. But it also strikes me there's a real need for us to work together on the implementation phase. This is like the first step on the 10 point, on 10 different things we need to achieve if we're truly going to end this practice and really minimize it. And I would ask participants to think about the Citizens Assembly that's coming up on the future of education. That's a great opportunity for us to really delve deep into what's happening within the education system. And I suppose the last point before I close up for the break is a big thanks to people on the chat box for your points and your contributions. It was really, I think everyone could see it, and it was great and was really important, and it did really aid the discussion. So thank you so much. And just to say to all our participants, if you can come back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.